The manor rises from the valley like a dark memory, its stone walls streaked with age, its windows staring out like blind eyes. The air here is thick with mist, curling through the trees and drifting over the long-forgotten road that leads to its gates. The land is quiet in a way that feels unnatural, as if the world itself has learned to hold its breath when it passes this place. They say Whitworth Manor was built in the late 1700s, raised high above the village on a ridge that catches the first light of dawn, though it is rarely touched by warmth. To the villagers below, it was never simply a home. From the beginning, it was a shadow, cast not only on the land, but on the lives of those who lived in its reach. Old records call it an estate of grandeur, a testament to the ambition of its founder. But paper lies easily, and stone holds the truth far longer. The truth is whispered in the stories of tragedy and disappearance that have clung to these walls for over 2 centuries. In the market square they still speak of it in hushed tones, not as history, but as something that continues, something that never stopped. At night, when the fog settles thick in the valley, some swear they can hear faint cries rising from the grounds. Sometimes it is the sound of a woman's voice, carried so softly on the wind that it might be mistaken for the moan of the trees. Other times it is sharper, a child's call, distant yet close enough to turn the blood cold. No one follows the sound. No one dares. From above, in the pale light of morning, the manor is both beautiful and terrible. Its roof lines cut against the sky like blackened teeth, its gardens overgrown into wild, tangled shapes. Faded photographs show it in another age, when the hedges were trimmed, the windows polished, and the gravel drive swept clean. Yet even then, the faces in the images seem distant, distracted, as though something just out of frame had taken their attention. In the archives, among yellowed documents and brittle maps, the Whitworth name repeats like a warning. The more one reads, the more it feels less like a family tree and more like a chain, each link dragging the next deeper into the same cold earth. And as we stand here at the edge of this story, looking up at the silent manor, the air seems to press in close, almost listening. This is no ordinary house, and the family who lived here were no ordinary people. Lord Elias Whitworth was a man the county once called generous, a patron of the arts, a benefactor to the poor. His name appeared in the ledgers of charities and church records, his hand shaking those of clergymen and aldermen alike. Yet those who saw him away from the public eye told a different tale. They spoke of a temper that flared without warning, of sudden storms that passed across his features like clouds over the sun, and of a hunger for influence that could never be satisfied. He was the one who envisioned Whitworth Manor, not as a family home, but as a monument to himself. The land it stands on was not freely given. Farmers who had tended it for generations were forced to sell, some driven into poverty, others found dead under circumstances the law politely called unfortunate. Each death was explained away, though never fully understood. And with every acre Elias claimed, his fortune grew. It grew quickly, unnaturally quickly, as if wealth itself had been drawn to him by some invisible thread. Among his private letters, now brittle with age, are fragments of something stranger still, phrases scrawled in the margins, unfamiliar symbols inked with a trembling hand, repeated lines about binding what is ours to something eternal. What that meant, none can say for certain, but it is known that Elias kept company with men of peculiar reputation, men rumored to have studied things far older than scripture. Villagers told of seeing him in the dead of night, walking the open moors without lantern or escort, his coat whipping in the wind as he muttered to the darkness in a tongue they did not recognize. Some claimed they watched him stop, kneel and press his hands into the earth, as though speaking to something beneath it. When confronted, Elias would smile with a courtesy so sharp it cut, and the questions would end there. Over time, the fine image he had built for himself began to crack. Neighbors noticed how guests to the manor seldom returned more than once, how certain rooms were kept locked even in daylight, and how the air inside his home felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Whether by design or by curse, Elias Whitworth had woven threads into his family's name that would never be pulled free. And somewhere in those early years, in the shadow of his ambition, the seeds of what was to come were already taking root. The union of Lord Elias Whitworth and Margaret Hensley should have been the crowning jewel of the county's social calendar. Margaret was young, striking, and the sole heir to a vast estate that had for generations stood in quiet rivalry with the Whitworth lands. Yet the match came only after tragedy. Her parents and younger brother perished in a sudden fire that consumed their home in the span of a single night. The cause was never proven, though whispers in the village suggested the flames had moved too quickly, too deliberately, to be an accident. Within months the engagement was announced. The wedding was lavish, yet curiously devoid of warmth. Guests spoke of the music playing too slowly, of the bride's pale face and distant eyes, and of the way Elias's smile never seemed to reach them. In the grand hall where the feast was held, the bridal table bore a single odd detail, a symbol carved deeply into the wood at its center. It was not decorative, not like the ornate carvings on the other furnishings. Those who saw it described a twisting circular mark that seemed to catch the eye no matter where you sat. By the end of the night, many swore it had not been there before the ceremony began. Some claimed the marriage was less about love and more about consolidation, a quiet arrangement that merged land, wealth, and perhaps something more intangible. Those close to the family began to notice strange changes almost immediately. Servants disappeared without notice, their names struck from the payroll as though they had never existed. The halls, once filled with the bustle of staff, began to grow quieter. Margaret, once known for her bright presence at social gatherings, retreated into the west wing of the manor within weeks. Few saw her after that, save for the occasional fleeting glimpse at an upper window. Some claimed she looked thinner, her face drawn, her movements slow as if she were always listening for something. On rare occasions, a muffled sound, neither cry nor laughter, was said to echo from the closed corridor leading to her rooms. What truly bound Margaret Hensley to Elias Whitworth remains a matter of speculation. Whether it was grief, fear, or the weight of some private bargain, the truth slipped behind the locked doors of the West Wing, where it would remain hidden for years to come. After Margaret withdrew from public view, the West Wing of Whitworth Manor fell into a kind of silence that was not simply the absence of sound, but something heavier, something watching. Elias ordered the doors locked, granting entry only to a select few servants, who never spoke openly of what they saw there. The corridor beyond the sealed archway grew cold, the air thick with a dampness that clung to the lungs, and the once polished floors gathered a fine layer of dust, despite the wing being inhabited. It was the chambermaids who first began to whisper about the sounds. At night, when the rest of the manor slept, they would hear faint scratching from inside the walls, a slow, deliberate sound, as though fingernails were tracing along the wooden beams. Sometimes, they said, the scratching would stop, replaced by a voice, soft, almost coaxing, calling Margaret's name. It was never frantic, it was patient, and it was always close enough to hear, but never near enough to find. Most unsettling of all was the night a visiting reverend, disturbed by the rumors, insisted on entering the West Wing to pray over it. The staff warned him against it, but Elias, with a curious smile, allowed him through the locked doors. No one knows what happened inside, only that the reverend did not return until dawn. He was found wandering the road that led from the manor, his steps uneven, his eyes glassy, as if seeing something far beyond the morning mist. His once dark hair had turned shock white, and from that day on he refused to speak of the Whitworths. The West Wing remained closed for decades after, its secret sealed behind warped wooden doors and windows draped in heavy velvet. Yet the villagers swore the place was never truly empty. On moonless nights, when the valley lay in complete darkness, flickers of candlelight were seen behind the West Wing windows, moving slowly from room to room. Those who watched too long claimed to see shapes in the glow, sometimes a woman's figure, sometimes something taller, with its head bent unnaturally low. Over the years, the silence of the West Wing became more than a household rule. It became a kind of boundary between the living and whatever had taken root there. And for those who served in the manor, it was understood without question, the locked doors were not there to keep them out, but to keep something else in. Thomas Hargreaves was just 16 when he vanished. A quiet, hard-working stable boy, he had been in the Whitworth service for barely a year, tending the horses and running errands between the manor and the village. On the evening he disappeared, the rain had been steady since morning, drumming against the roof of the stables and turning the courtyard to slick, black mud. According to his sister, who worked as a kitchen maid, Thomas had been asked to carry a small package to the West Wing, a wing no servant went into without being called. She remembered the way he hesitated when told, glancing toward the locked archway as if weighing the risk. Still, he went. He never came back. When the Whitworths were questioned, Elias himself claimed the boy had left that very night for London in search of better pay. It was a simple explanation, one that might have been believed if Thomas's sister hadn't sworn she saw him pass through the West Wing door with the package still under his arm. The police were summoned, though their investigation was swift and perfunctory. They searched the manor, or at least the rooms they were permitted to enter, and questioned the staff, most of whom gave clipped, careful answers. Days later, after the search had officially ended, a gardener found something lodged in the iron grate of the manor's drainage channel. It was Thomas's cap, the brim torn, the wool heavy with water, and streaked with a brown stain that rain could not wash away. Tests at the time could not confirm what the stain was, but modern forensic historians who examined preserved fibers decades later are certain it was blood. No body was ever recovered. No official charges were made. In the absence of proof, the Whitworth account stood, and Thomas Hargreaves was recorded as a runaway. But in the village, no one believed it. His sister left her position at the manor soon after, never speaking of it again, though some say she refused to walk past the estate for the rest of her life. Looking back, researchers now suspect Thomas's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy, but the first in a long sequence that would follow a disturbing rhythm. A rhythm marked by the quiet removal of those who served the Whitworths and the quiet closing of the West Wing doors behind them. The boy's fate remains a question without an answer, though the land seems to remember, and the manor perhaps does too. The children of Elias and Margaret Whitworth were spoken of in the village with a mix of pity and unease. Alistair, the eldest, carried himself with the rigid posture of a man twice his age, his pale eyes often fixed on things no one else could see. Records from his schooling, what little of it took place outside the manor, note an early fascination with anatomy, not the study of the human body in the polite, academic sense, but in the cutting of it open, the mapping of veins and organs with a cold precision. Rumors spread among the staff of small animals gone missing from the grounds, only for their remains to be found carefully arranged on Alistair's desk in the attic room. Helena, the middle child, was said to be quiet and strange even by Whitworth standards. Surviving pages from her diary speak of long conversations with someone beneath the floorboards. She described them as kind, though they asked for things she would not write down. She drew symbols over and over, intricate spirals and interlocking shapes, often smudged as though she had traced them in the dark. Servants delivering her meals claimed they sometimes heard her speaking in whispers to no one, then laughing softly, as if answering a private joke. James, the youngest, was the most unpredictable. In his portraits, his eyes seemed to dart just off frame, as though caught mid-glance towards something that had moved behind the painter. His behavior grew erratic as he reached adolescence, fits of shouting in the night, long spells where he refused to eat, claiming the food was not meant for him. Eventually, his outbursts became so violent that he was confined to a suite of rooms on the manor's upper floor. The official reason given was illness. Those who tended to him left quickly, often without collecting their pay, and never returned. All three were raised almost entirely within the manor's walls. Tutors came and went, some staying only weeks before departing under unclear circumstances. The children rarely mingled with the village or even with each other, their lives unfolding in separate shadowed corners of the house. In the surviving portraits, the siblings never smile. Their clothes are fine, their posture perfect, but there is a sameness to their faces, a hollowed look in the eyes that makes it hard to tell their ages at all. It is as if the years had passed differently for them, moving slower, or perhaps not moving at all. Whatever shaped them inside those walls left a mark deeper than blood, and it would not fade. The fire began on a still, cold night in the spring of 1843. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of rain that never came, and the moon hung pale and thin over the valley. By midnight, the first glow was seen in the high windows of the manor's chapel, flickering like candlelight until it swelled into something far brighter, far more violent. The alarm spread quickly through the servants' quarters, but by the time the first bucket of water was thrown, the flames had already consumed the wooden rafters. 3 servants were trapped inside before anyone realized they were missing. Their names were entered into the parish records with a single line beside each, "perished in the fire." What was not recorded was what the survivors claimed to see, that the blaze did not begin in the pews or the altar, but from beneath the chapel itself. The floor of the chapel had long held a sealed crypt, its iron hatch rusted shut for decades. Witnesses swore the fire seemed to erupt from that hatch, as though something inside had forced its way up, splintering the stone and belching thick black smoke that behaved like no smoke they had ever seen. It twisted against the wind, curling back toward the manor, seeping into its eaves. Even over the roaring of the flames, a sound could be heard, a high, keening wail, not quite human, that rose and fell with a rhythm too steady to be the chaos of fire. Some swore it came from the crypt, others from the smoke itself. Those who heard it said the memory of that sound never left them. The fire was contained before it reached the rest of the manor, but the chapel was reduced to blackened stone and smouldering beams. The crypt beneath was left open, its contents, if there were any, never spoken of. Within months, the Whitworths began rebuilding, replacing the ruined wing with new rooms and sealing the ground over the crypt completely. The chapel was never restored. In the years that followed, the plot of earth where the chapel had stood became barren. No grass grew there, no flowers, not even weeds. The soil itself seemed dead, crumbling to dust at the touch. Farmers avoided it, claiming it was cursed, while children dared one another to stand on it after dark. Few ever did. The Whitworths carried on as though nothing had happened, but in the village, people whispered of the black smoke and the wailing voice. Some believed the fire had not destroyed something, but set it free, and whatever it was, they feared it had not gone far. It was during a renovation in the early 1920s that workmen stumbled upon a narrow panel in one of the manor's unused bedrooms. Behind it, hidden deep in the wall, was a small compartment lined with dust and cobwebs. Inside lay a single object wrapped in brittle cloth, a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed, its spine cracked but intact. The name written inside in careful, slanting script was Helena Whitworth. At first, the entries seemed harmless, the musings of a young woman describing her days in the manor, but as the pages turned, the tone shifted. She began to write about the Whispering Man, a figure who visited her at night, though no one else in the house ever saw him. She claimed he stood in the corner of her room, cloaked in shadow, speaking in a voice too soft to belong to any living person. He told her he could keep her young forever, that time would never touch her if she gave him an offering. She never explained what that meant, only that it was something he would take himself if it was not given. Helena also described her games in the West Wing, which had been closed to most of the household. She claimed she played there with the ones in the dark, companions she insisted were not ghosts, though she would not say what they truly were. She described their laughter as cold, their touch as light as dust falling on skin. Sometimes they would sing to her, strange lilting songs in a language she could not name. Most chilling were her descriptions of something she called the gathering. It came, she wrote, once every 7 years, always on the same night. Servants would vanish from the halls, the air would grow heavy, and the manor would fill with a sound like distant chanting. She hinted that she had been a part of it, though her words danced around the details, as if she could not, or would not, write them plainly. Her last entry was dated on a moonless night. It begins with a line about the whispering man standing closer than ever before, his voice louder, his presence almost touching her. The ink trails suddenly, the letters breaking apart mid-word, as though the pen had been torn from her hand. A dark smear bleeds across the page, the mark of a final movement made in panic. Helena Whitworth was never seen after that year, and whatever the whispering man had promised her, it seemed he had come to collect. The stories of the gathering stretch back further than most can remember, passed down in hushed voices that grew quieter with each telling. To some, it was nothing more than a superstition, a shadowy legend meant to frighten children into staying close to home. But in the village records, there is a pattern too clear to dismiss. Every 7 years, without fail, someone would vanish. A young servant on an errand to the manor, a child who had wandered too far from the path, a peddler seen walking toward the estate, but never away from it. No body was ever found, no answers were ever given. On those same nights, the Whitworth family would host their most private of gatherings. The ledgers speak of extravagant purchases, barrels of wine, rare meats, exotic spices, enough to feed a hall of guests. Yet not a single villager could recall being invited. The doors would be closed long before dusk, the gates locked, and the manor would vanish into its own world. Those who lived close enough to see the upper floors told of lights flickering in patterns too strange to be candlelight, moving from room to room as though following some deliberate path. Others swore they heard a low murmur carrying across the fields, a sound that was not quite music, not quite speech. One farmer claimed that when he stepped closer to listen, the murmur split into many voices chanting in a rhythm that made his skin crawl, and though he could not understand the words, he knew they were not meant for human ears. In the days after, the manor would return to its usual state, silent, cold, and watchful. The Whitworths never spoke of the feasts, and the disappearances were chalked up to misfortune or chance, but the fear in the village lingered. Parents kept their children indoors when the 7-year mark approached, and servants would find excuses to leave their posts before that date could arrive. Historians today pore over the accounts, weighing them against the family's own records. The facts are undeniable. The disappearances align with the nights of the gatherings. Whether these nights were coincidence, curse, or ritual, no one can say with certainty. But as the years stretched on, the pattern never broke. And for those who dared to look up at the manor's windows on those nights, the sight of that strange, restless light was enough to know whatever the gathering was, it was not meant to be seen. Reverend Thomas Cole was not a man easily swayed by rumor. He had served the parish for over 20 years, walking the lanes between scattered farms in all weather, tending to the sick, and speaking plainly when he saw sin festering in his flock. So when word reached him of strange rites being carried out in Whitworth Manor, of lights burning through the night, of chanting heard in the fields, he did not dismiss it. He prepared a sermon on false gods and whispered evils, but by the following Sunday he had resolved to take his warning directly to the family. On a cold evening in November of 1851, he was seen entering the manor gates. A servant later recalled the sound of his voice echoing in the main hall, raised in sharp argument with Alistair Whitworth. What was said between them is lost, but the tone was enough to send the staff scurrying. 3 days later, Reverend Cole's body was found in the manor's orchard. His throat had been cut cleanly, but his eyes were gone, the skin around them bruised as though they had been taken while he still lived. The sight was so grotesque that the constable turned away before the body could be examined in full. The official report was thin, concluding that the Reverend had fallen victim to highway robbers. Yet the orchard lay within the manor walls, far from any road. and the soil near where his body was found was strangely disturbed, as though something heavy had been dragged toward the west wing. When investigators pressed further, they found smears of dried blood on the inner door to that wing, blood later matched to the Reverend's clothing. But that door had been locked from the inside. Elias Whitworth refused to allow it to be opened, citing the privacy of his family. Witnesses who had spoken freely in the days after the murder began to change their accounts. One by one they retracted statements, claimed to have been mistaken, or left the county altogether. No one would testify, and without them there could be no trial. The church buried Reverend Cole in the far corner of the graveyard, away from the main path, and his name was spoken less and less until it faded from the sermons entirely. But among the villagers, a quieter truth endured. Reverend Cole had gone to the manor to cast something out. Whatever he faced there did not leave with him, and it had taken his eyes to ensure he would never see again. James Whitworth had always been the most fragile of Elias and Margaret's children. Pale and restless, he seemed to drift in and out of the present, his mind often fixed on things no one else could see. While Alistair and Helena moved through the manor with a strange, cold purpose, James was kept largely from view. Servants were told he was ill, though illness could not explain the strange words that spilled from his mouth when he wandered alone. In the autumn of 1858, a shepherd found him on the moors at dusk, his fine clothes muddied, his bare feet torn from walking without shoes. He was muttering, over and over, about doors beneath the earth and voices older than God. The shepherd led him back to the manor, but James resisted, digging his heels into the ground, as if afraid of crossing the threshold. When questioned later, he could not, or would not, say where he had been. In the weeks that followed, his behavior worsened. He refused food for days, then would eat ravenously, only to retch it back up, as though something inside rejected it. At night, he shouted in his sleep, calling out to open the way, or to keep them closed. The family confined him to a bedroom in the upper floor, bolting the door from the outside. 2 servants were assigned to watch him in shifts, though they never lasted long. One night in late November, the house was quiet, save for the wind outside. When a maid brought his morning meal, she found the door still bolted, yet the room was empty. The bedclothes were undisturbed, the window latched from within. The only sign of his passage was a thin line of coarse salt stretching from the bed to the door, continuing down the corridor. The trail led to the cellar, where the air hung damp and still. On the far side, in the oldest section of the floor, the wooden boards bowed upward, warped as if something beneath had pressed against them. The boards creaked when touched, though no hollow space could be found. The salt ended there, scattered in uneven piles. No trace of James was ever recovered. The Whitworths said he had fled the manor again, vanishing into the moors, but in the village, no one believed it. They spoke instead of the doors James had warned about, and of the thing that might have opened them from below. Whatever it was, they believed it had claimed him and closed the way behind him. By the closing years of the 19th century, the Whitworth fortune was a shadow of what it had been. The lands that had once stretched for miles around the manor were sold off in pieces. First the far fields, then the tenant cottages, then even the wooded hills that had stood untouched for generations. Yet the manor itself was never part of these sales. When the last direct heir died without children, the house passed into the hands of a distant cousin, Edmund Whitworth. Edmund arrived with the air of a man determined to set things right. He spoke openly to the press, promising to restore the house to its former glory and to put an end to what he called silly village superstitions. The gates, long closed to outsiders, were thrown open to work crews. Stone was scrubbed clean, shattered windows replaced, and the gardens, wild and unkempt for decades, were trimmed into neat, proper shapes. To the villagers, it seemed the curse of the Whitworths might finally be fading. But behind the public image of a modern, practical man, Edmund's private letters told another story. Hidden among mundane notes about expenses and repairs were passages about the old pacts and the preservation of the debt. He wrote of studying symbols carved into the manor's beams, tracing their history to a bargain struck in Elias's time. In one letter, he confided to a fellow antiquarian that his family's fortune had been sealed in a way that could not be broken without consequence. It was not long before the whispers began again. A farmhand working late claimed to see Edmund alone in the orchard at midnight, walking in a slow circle, muttering words too low to catch. Another reported strange shapes burned into the grass there, dark rings that did not fade with the weeks. Then came the disappearances. First a kitchen maid, last seen leaving the village with a basket for the manor. Then a peddler who had been invited to deliver rare spices. Neither returned, and no one in the house claimed to have seen them. Though Edmund kept up appearances, hosting polite gatherings in the drawing room and greeting the vicar with an easy smile, there was something in his eyes, an eagerness, a watchfulness, that unsettled those who met him. The manor had changed hands, but its hold on the dark things whispered about for over a century had not loosened. If anything, under Edmund, it seemed to have tightened. It was during the summer of 1893, with the manor deep in the midst of restoration, that the workers reached the dining room. The task seemed simple enough. Strip away the faded wallpaper and replace it with something more fashionable. The room was bright in the morning sun, the air filled with the dry rasp of paper peeling from plaster. But as the last layer came away, the chatter of the crew fell silent. Beneath the paper, the plaster was mottled with stains, large uneven shapes that bled deep into the wall. The color had darkened over time into a brown, so deep it was almost black. But the irregular patterns were unmistakable. One man, a veteran of military service, murmured that he had seen such marks before, though not on walls. The foreman ordered work to continue, but his voice shook when he said it. In the weeks that followed, small samples of the plaster were sent away for testing. The results, when they came, were met with silence. The stains were human blood, their age measured not in years but in decades. No record existed of any injury or violence in the dining room, at least not in the official accounts of the Whitworth household. What disturbed the men more than the stains were the carvings that surrounded them. At first glance they appeared to be decorative etchings, but under the dust their lines formed curling spirals and interlocking loops, identical to those drawn in the recovered diary of Helena Whitworth. The symbols ran in a broken ring around the room, as though marking a boundary. Inside that circle, the blood was thickest. When the findings were presented to Edmund Whitworth, he dismissed them with a wave of his hand. He claimed they were remnants of historic superstition, the work of fearful servants in some long-forgotten age. But his explanation did nothing to settle the unease that had taken hold of the crew. Men began to complain of headaches, of hearing soft knocks from inside the walls. One swore that when he bent to examine a symbol more closely, the plaster felt warm beneath his fingertips. Within a fortnight, the restoration team had abandoned the manor entirely. Tools lay where they had been dropped, ladders leaning against unfinished walls, as if the workers had left in haste. None returned to collect their wages. In the village, they spoke only in fragments about what they had seen, but all agreed on one thing. The dining room of Whitworth Manor had been a place where something was done, something that had seeped into the very walls, and refused to let go. The Whitworth pact came to light not through rumor but through paper, old brittle pages that had lain hidden in the back of a solicitor's archive. They surfaced by accident during the sorting of an estate in the early 20th century. Among them was a fragment of a will, unsigned and yellowed with age, alongside a set of legal notes written in a careful, slanting hand. Both bore the Whitworth name. The language was strange for a legal document, its terms vague yet heavy with implication. One clause stood out above all others. The family's lands and holdings were to remain whole and untouched, in perpetuity, so long as the offering continues unbroken. No explanation followed, no definition of what the offering might be, yet the phrasing was repeated across multiple pages, as if to ensure it could not be overlooked. The dating of the documents suggested they were drawn up in the late 1700s, Elias Whitworth's time. Historians examining the style of writing noted peculiar flourishes and symbols in the margins, marks that bore resemblance to those used by certain occult fraternities active in England during that century. These were not harmless gentlemen's clubs devoted to poetry or politics, but societies whose rituals were whispered to involve blood, oaths, and the binding of fortunes to powers best left unnamed. Some experts believe Elias may have sought such a group's aid in securing the Whitworth wealth, crafting a pact not merely legal, but supernatural. Others argue the clause was metaphorical, a reflection of the era's taste for the dramatic. But those who have studied the family's history see a troubling correlation, the continuation of the manor's prosperity alongside a cycle of disappearances and deaths that seem to feed into that very offering. What troubles modern researchers most is the way the clause is worded. It does not say the offering must be made by the family. It simply says it must continue. It makes no distinction between the living Whitworths and whoever might inherit their place. In theory, anyone in possession of the manor could become bound to its terms, knowingly or not. Whether symbolic or binding in a darker sense, the pact remains a shadow over the family's legacy. And if it was more than words, if it was sealed with something beyond the reach of courts, then breaking it might not only strip the land from its owner, it might bring an end to whatever has been sustained by the offering, an end that those who made the pact may have feared more than death itself. In the autumn of 1912, Whitworth Manor became the stage for what was meant to be an exposé. A journalist from London, eager to dispel the manor's reputation for hauntings, arranged for a group of spiritualist investigators to conduct a séance in the great drawing room. The plan was simple: stage the spectacle, pull back the curtain, and print the truth. Candles were set on every table, curtains drawn tight, and the long dining table cleared for the medium's tools: a crystal ball, letters, and a board marked with symbols. At first it played out exactly as expected. The medium swayed, murmuring in a low voice, her fingers twitching as the glass on the board slid from letter to letter. A few of the guests smirked at the theatrics, exchanging knowing glances with the journalist. But then the medium stopped, her back arched sharply, her eyes rolling white, and a guttural sound escaped her lips, low, resonant, not her own. Witnesses said the voice that followed was unmistakably male, speaking in the measured, deliberate tone of someone long dead. It named itself as Elias Whitworth. The words that came next were not the vague warnings common to parlor tricks. They were specific, cold, and heavy with intent. The offering is overdue. The journalist, who had been leaning forward in amusement moments before, was now pale and still. The medium's convulsions grew violent, her chair skidding across the floor as though pushed by unseen hands. Then, as the voice rose to a low, drawn-out growl, every candle in the room went out at once. The sudden darkness was absolute. Chairs scraped, feet shuffled in panic, and someone knocked over a glass, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the black. A woman screamed, then was cut off as if a hand had closed over her mouth. Those who stayed claimed they felt movement in the room, something brushing past their legs, a breath against their ears. When the candles were finally relit, the medium lay slumped over the table, her face drained of color, her eyes open but unseeing. She lived, though she never returned to the manor. Several guests fled into the night and refused to speak of what had happened in the darkness. The journalist never published his promised article. Instead, he left Whitworth Manor the following morning without a word, carrying only his notes, which were later found burned in his London flat. Whatever he had come to disprove had, in the space of a few minutes, convinced him utterly. Clara Whitworth was different from the others in her family. Educated at Oxford, she was known for her quick wit and warm manner, more often seen in the company of friends than in the shadowed corridors of Whitworth Manor. Yet in the summer of 1927, she returned home, exchanging her bright student life for the heavy quiet of the estate. Those who saw her in the village that week remarked that she seemed distracted, glancing over her shoulder as though expecting to see someone following her. On the night she vanished, the manor was still. Her room, a high-ceilinged chamber in the east wing, was found locked from the inside the next morning. The bedclothes were pulled halfway to the floor, and near the headboard, the floorboards bore deep splintered marks, as if clawed at in desperation. The window was shut and latched, the curtains undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry. When the police were called, they scoured the grounds, combing the orchards and gardens, sending men to search the moors. Nothing. Inside her desk, however, they found her diary. The final entries were unlike the earlier pages, where she had written of lectures, friends, and books. These last lines spoke instead of the family debt, and of dreams where she heard a voice whispering from the west wing calling her by name. She wrote of shadows moving beneath her door, of waking to find her mirror fogged with words she had not written. Her final entry, dated the night before she disappeared, was short. "I think it's my turn. I can hear them in the walls." The official report declared her missing, presumed dead, though no body was ever recovered. The locked room mystery puzzled the investigators, but in the village there was little puzzlement, only a grim acceptance. The Whitworth debt, they said, had claimed another. For nearly a century, Clara's fate remained a mystery. Then, during a survey of the manor's sealed west wing in the early 2000s, a workman prying loose warped floorboards found a small tarnished hairpin. Photographs from the 1920s confirmed it matched one Clara often wore. How it had come to rest in a wing locked long before her disappearance was a question no one could answer. The pin was quietly turned over to local authorities, who placed it in storage. It sits there still, cold and gleaming under glass, a small relic of a young woman who seemed for a time to have escaped her family's darkness, only to be drawn back into it. When war came to England, Whitworth Manor was taken not by choice, but by necessity. Its wide halls and high ceilings were deemed suitable for a military hospital, and within weeks beds lined the grand rooms, their polished floors covered with scuffed linoleum. The Whitworth family was moved out, and the house filled with the groans of the wounded, the hurried steps of nurses, and the smell of antiseptic cutting through the building's older, heavier scent. At first the soldiers thought little of the house's reputation. They had seen enough death to be unshaken by old village tales. But as the weeks passed, unease began to grow. Men woke in the night to find deep scratches gouged into the plaster beside their beds, scratches that hadn't been there the evening before. Others swore they heard slow, heavy breathing in the darkness, close enough to feel on their skin, only to find the ward empty when they turned on the light. One nurse, a young woman named Elsie, spoke later of an incident she never forgot. She was making her rounds just after midnight when she entered a patient's room and saw, at the foot of his bed, a woman in Victorian dress. The gown was faded but immaculate, the lace at her throat yellowed with age. The figure stood utterly still, her hands folded neatly, her face turned down toward the patient. Elsie blinked, and the woman was gone. The man in the bed died only hours later without waking. Word of such occurrences spread quietly through the wards. Men began refusing to sleep alone, and some begged to be moved to the newer hospital miles away. A few were granted transfers, but most remained, living in a state of watchful dread. When the war ended, and the soldiers left, the government considered keeping the building for state use. But the reports filed discreetly, never publicized, painted a troubling picture of unexplained deaths, strange sounds, and staff desertions. A handful of officials suggested burning the manor to the ground, erasing its long, unsettling history once and for all. In the end, the building was returned to the Whitworth family. They accepted it without comment, as if the years of war had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Yet for those who had served within its walls, the memory of those long nights remained vivid. They had gone to war expecting danger on the battlefield. It was in the summer of 1964, during what was meant to be a simple modernization of the manor's west wing, that the workmen found it. They had been removing warped floorboards in a disused corridor when one of the boards gave way beneath a boot, revealing not the expected joists, but a black void. Shining a torch into the gap, they saw stone steps descending into the earth, slick with moisture and worn down in the center from years of use. The foreman ordered the space cleared and lanterns brought in. What they found below had the stillness of a place long forgotten, though the air was thick with a sour metallic smell. The cellar was small but carefully constructed, its walls of rough stone weeping with damp. In the center stood a slab of dark stone, waist high, its surface carved with spiraling, interlocking symbols, the same patterns seen in Helena Whitworth's diary, and in the plaster of the dining room decades earlier. Along the walls hung rusted chains, their links fused together with age, some ending in cuffs small enough for a child's wrists. The floor held shallow pits, and in them lay bones. Some were scattered and broken, others arranged with deliberate care. Even to the untrained eye, it was clear these were human remains. When authorities were quietly brought in, forensic examination revealed something far worse. The bones belonged to at least 14 individuals, their deaths spanning more than a century. Men, women, children. Some skeletons showed signs of injury before death, others none at all. All had been interred here, beneath the west wing, in a space no one outside the Whitworth household had likely seen in generations. The official record of the discovery was brief, and no photographs were ever released. Within days, the cellar was ordered sealed. The workers who had been present were paid in full and dismissed, with the understanding that the matter was not to be discussed. Most stayed silent. But decades later, one of those men, a carpenter named Alfred Price, broke his silence. In an interview, his voice shook as he described the altar, the chains, and the feeling that someone was standing just behind him as he worked. He claimed the air in the cellar had felt alive, pressing against his skin, making it hard to breathe. Even after leaving the manor, he said he dreamed of the place often, waking with the taste of earth and iron in his mouth. The cellar remains sealed to this day, buried beneath the floors of the west wing, its contents left in darkness once again. Whatever purpose it once served, its silence now feels less like peace and more like waiting. By the early 1970s, the long, twisting Whitworth bloodline had narrowed to a single thread. Arthur Whitworth, the last of his name, lived alone in the manor, attended only by a small, aging staff who kept mostly to the kitchen and servant quarters. To the villagers, he was a figure glimpsed more than known. A pale face at a high window, a dark silhouette lingering behind the curtains as dusk fell. Those who passed the estate after nightfall claimed they often saw him standing perfectly still in the lamplight, his gaze fixed toward the village below. No one could say how long he stood there, but some swore they had seen him in the same place hours apart, unmoving. Others spoke of hearing faint music drifting from the house on nights when no lights burned inside. By then the gardens had fallen back into wildness, and the gates, though never locked, seemed to push back at anyone who tried to pass through. Rumors spread that Arthur had lost his mind, speaking aloud to empty rooms, and pacing the halls as though following someone unseen. A tradesman who came to repair the roof swore he heard Arthur in the drawing room carrying on a lively conversation, though only one voice answered. When the man stepped inside, Arthur was alone, smiling faintly, his eyes distant. He almost never entered the village, and when he did, it was with a wary, distracted air, buying little more than bread or paper before returning up the long drive. Those who managed to speak to him said his words were polite but strange, half-thought sentences about preparations and keeping the door closed until the hour. In 1981, Arthur Whitworth was found dead in his bed by the housekeeper. There were no signs of struggle, no cause beyond the simple stopping of the heart. But in the days after his death, the solicitor revealed the contents of his will. Among the usual bequests and instructions was a final peculiar clause. The manor was to be left untouched and locked until the debt is settled. No explanation was given, no description of the debt, no heir to claim the house. The building was shuttered, its windows boarded, and the drive overgrown. Yet even locked and empty, it was not silent. On certain nights, those passing on the road below claimed to see a figure in the upper windows, gazing out at the village, just as Arthur had, year after year, as if still keeping watch for something only he could see. The auction of Whitworth Manor took place on a grey March afternoon in 1983. The building had stood locked for 2 years, its windows boarded, its gardens choked with weeds, and yet the great hall was filled with bidders, collectors, developers, and the merely curious, all drawn by the chance to own a piece of its infamous history. The auctioneer's voice echoed against the high ceiling, his words crisp, his manner brisk. But those who attended remember something else about that day. From the moment the bidding began, the air inside seemed to grow colder, as though a draught had slipped in through the sealed windows. A faint, metallic tang clung to the back of the throat. Some shifted in their seats, rubbing their arms, as if to warm themselves. By the third round of bidding, 2 guests had excused themselves, pale and shaking, complaining of sudden nausea. Another followed shortly after, his face slick with sweat. The bidding went on, narrowing to a few determined voices, until the final offer was accepted. The winning bidder was anonymous at the time, his identity shielded by a representative. It was only later revealed to be Daniel Price, a wealthy historian known for his private collection of rare artifacts and his interest in architectural preservation. In an interview, Price spoke warmly of his plans to restore the manor and convert it into a private museum, a place where the Whitworth legacy could be displayed, and in his words finally understood. Within weeks, work began. Crews arrived to clear the grounds and strip away the boards from the windows. Price was often seen walking the halls with a notebook in hand, pausing to study details in the woodwork or symbols carved into the stone. For a time, it seemed the manor might finally have a future. But before the year was out, the work stopped. The crews left abruptly, their equipment still stacked in the drive. Price himself was rarely seen, and when he did appear, it was with a gauntness that had not been there before. He offered no explanation, only that the project was no longer viable. By the following spring, the manor stood silent once more. Price had abandoned it entirely, leaving behind only a short statement, citing personal reasons he refused to elaborate on. The building was locked again, its windows dark, its gardens returning to weeds. And in the village, the talk began anew that whatever had lived within those walls had found its way to the historian and convinced him to leave. By the early 1990s, Whitworth Manor had slipped beyond the reach of serious buyers and preservationists, but it had found a new audience. Word of its long, unsettling history drew ghost hunters, amateur paranormal groups, and television crews eager to catch something unexplainable on film. The gates were often found forced open, and the once shuttered windows stood ajar, as if the house itself were letting them in. The first investigations were small and clumsy, 2 or 3 people with tape recorders and flashlights, walking the long halls and whispering to each other. But even those early visits produced something strange. On more than one recording, a low voice could be heard beneath the investigators' chatter, repeating the same words over and over 7 years. The voice was quiet but insistent, neither male nor female, and it never wavered in tone. As the manor's reputation grew, more sophisticated teams arrived, bringing cameras, motion sensors, and electromagnetic detectors. Yet the equipment rarely behaved as expected. Batteries that had been fully charged would drain within minutes of entering the West Wing. Cameras that recorded flawlessly outside would freeze or corrupt their footage when turned towards certain rooms. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly, dropping 10 degrees in seconds, then rising again without cause. The most disturbing accounts came from those who lost time inside the manor. An investigator named Paul Rennick reported walking into the dining room at 10:15 p.m., checking his watch as he set up a camera. When he next looked down, it read 1:42 a.m., though he swore only a few minutes had passed. His colleagues claimed he had been standing in the same spot the entire time, staring ahead, unresponsive to their calls. Others described similar experiences, blinking and finding hours gone, or stepping into one room and emerging to find the sun in a different place in the sky. None could remember what happened in the missing hours. In every case, the investigators left with more questions than answers. Some vowed never to return, while others became obsessed, convinced that the manor was guarding a secret that could be uncovered if only they stayed long enough. But time and again, the house refused to yield anything more than fragments. A whispered phrase, a flicker of movement in the corner of a frame, a sudden cold that passed as quickly as it came. And always, somewhere on the recordings, that same quiet voice, repeating the same words, as if reminding them of a schedule only it understood: 7 years. It was late in the summer of 2007, when a 17-year-old from the nearby town slipped through the rusted gates of Whitworth Manor. Friends said it was a dare, one final thrill before the school year began. He carried a cheap flashlight, and the restless bravado of someone certain the stories were nothing but old village superstition. The security cameras, installed years earlier by the property's absentee owners, caught him crossing the overgrown lawn just after midnight. His steps were steady, his light bobbing as he moved toward the west wing. The footage is clear until he reaches the shadow of the building. There, in the narrow strip between two boarded windows, he pauses. For several seconds, he stands motionless, as if listening. Then he turns, walking directly toward the wing's sealed entrance. The moment he steps into the corner of the frame, the feed shudders, the image bending into jagged lines before dissolving into static. It lasts only 12 seconds. When the picture clears, the patch of grass where the boy had stood is empty. The flashlight lies on its side, its beam catching the edge of the wall. He is never seen again. The search was extensive. Police, volunteers, and even trained dogs combed the grounds and surrounding woodland. Not a trace was found. The west wing remained locked, its warped door still chained and bolted from the outside. Officials concluded he must have fled the property during the brief camera outage, yet no other camera caught him leaving. His friends swore they never saw him emerge. In the village, the date of his disappearance stirred an older memory. Exactly 7 years earlier, in 2000, a man cataloguing architectural details for the county had vanished after entering the manor alone. Before that, 1993. And before that, 1986. Each case separated by precisely 7 years, each unsolved. Whispers began again of the Whitworth pact, of the offering promised in the documents from centuries before. The family might be gone, their bloodline ended, but perhaps the bargain had not been with them at all. Perhaps it had been with the house, or with whatever the house sheltered. The camera footage was quietly archived, its release to the public denied on the grounds of privacy. But those who have seen it remember the boy's last moment in the frame, the way he turned toward the west wing, as if answering a call, a summons too quiet for the microphone to catch. And they wonder what waited for him on the other side of the static. Whitworth Manor stands as it has for decades, silent, shuttered, its gates chained, and rusting beneath the weight of time. The gardens have swallowed the paths, and the drive is little more than a track of cracked stone beneath tangled weeds. From the road, it looks utterly lifeless, yet the locals insist it is not. On certain nights when the moon is low and the mist curls thick along the valley, they say candlelight glows in the high windows, shifting from one room to another as if carried by an unseen hand. The land itself feels wrong. No birds settle in the trees near the estate, and even the wind seems to skirt the grounds, moving in odd, uneven gusts that die before they reach the manor walls. Dogs, when brought too close, refuse to step onto the property, straining at their leads with low, warning growls. Those who have climbed the fence speak of a stillness so deep it presses against the ears, making them aware of their own breathing and of another slower breath that does not belong to them. Urban explorers, drawn by the house's history and its morbid reputation, tell stories that are strangely consistent. They speak of markings on the walls, spirals, loops, and curling lines like those recorded in Helena Whitworth's diary. Yet the shapes are never quite the same from one visit to the next. Some swear they have seen fresh carvings in the dust-covered plaster, the edges sharp as if made only moments before. More than one visitor has reported feeling watched, though no one is ever there when they turn. Others describe hearing the faint rustle of movement behind them, followed by the sensation of breath at the nape of the neck, warm and slow, as if whatever stood there was in no hurry to leave. No official plans exist for the property. Developers have shown interest, but none have followed through. The cost of restoring the structure is high, but the cost of entering it may be higher. In the village, the older residents say the place is better left alone, that the manor has its own rules, and those rules have nothing to do with ownership. The Whitworth family is gone, their name carved into history and gravestones. But perhaps the legacy was never truly theirs. Perhaps they were only caretakers, bound to something older, something patient. And perhaps it is still there, waiting in the quiet, behind the locked doors, for the next one to answer its call.